Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Inside Out lecture today. I am here in place of Professor Simon Morris. I won't tell you where he is, but it's slightly warmer than it is here where he is. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today. When Simon Morris does his usual introduction, he says something along the lines of the purpose of Inside Out is to get some of the best minds of our generation to Leeds to speak to the assembled in front of us. And last week we had the artist Anna Ben David. The week before we had the Professor of Digital Media from MIT. And so he's good to his word in terms of some of the best minds. But I think it's really important that we recognise and celebrate the minds that are here amongst us at Leeds Beckett University. And so our guest today is from within our university, but not immediately within the School of Arts. It's Professor Anna Abraham from Psychology. She's Professor of Psychology in the School of Social Sciences. And I think there are two reasons why this is really exciting. One, her work, but also the fact that we are being interdisciplinary. The School of the Arts is stretching beyond its usual remit into the field of social sciences, and I think it's really exciting that we've got somebody to talk to us from psychology today. A little bit about Anna Abraham. She's based in Leeds, but before she came here, her teaching career meant that she taught in Germany and Kuwait. Her education took place in India, in the UK, and then her PhD in Germany. So it's nice to have those different insights there. In terms of how I came across Anna's work, I have the library here at Leeds Beckett to thank, because they did a display of her most recent book, and it caught my eye. And then I came upon an announcement for Leeds International Festival, where Anna was speaking about creativity, and I mentioned this to Simon. I said, she'd be great to have as part of the Inside Out series. And he said, oh, I know Anna. And he knows her sufficiently well to invite her and then not be here to host her. This is her latest book. It's The Neuroscience of Creativity. It came out last year with Cambridge University Press. She also works on the interrelationship between fiction and reality. She works on imagination. She works on the question of whether madness has an interrelationship with creativity as well. So I hope there's going to be some really exciting insights today. And as usual, there's the opportunity for you to ask questions after the lecture. So if you could please join me in a big Leeds welcome to Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. That was very generous and very unexpected as well. I've been to many of these Inside Out lectures, and I kind of loved them. And so it was delightful for me to be asked by Simon on one of our train journeys, because we both live in York. What I'm going to do, I know, is very different from the kind of things you're routinely used to seeing. Although there are no two talks that I've seen on the Inside Out lectures that are similar. But this will probably be on the more nerdy end of the spectrum of how we study creativity. I've studied creativity my entire research career since my PhD. And I hope to give you, in this talk, some insights about how we examine creativity and how we study creativity, and why this particular approach, the neuroscientific approach, is important. Can everyone hear me properly? Is that fine? Cool. All right. I want to start with some cautionary tales, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with neuroscientific research. But it does come, because it has been coming recently into a lot of controversy, because I think people generalize too much from neuroscience, and I want to talk about what the challenge of neuroscience is. For psychologists like myself, philosophers of mind, and so on, there's a lot of great appeal in going to the neurosciences, because psychologists want to understand the human mind. We want to understand why people think and behave the way they do, and neuroscientific techniques allow us to get a step closer with that, we think. by looking at brain activity patterns, for instance, or while someone is engaged in a task, for instance. The problem with this, though, is that the language that the brain speaks is very different from the way we think the brain speaks. So what happens, there are a lot of errors can take place, sometimes they're kind of innocent, but they get perpetuated. And I'm going to base a lot of my talk on some of the myths that have been perpetuated and to understand where they stem from and whether they're myths or not. And I think it's important to do that because a lot of research shows that the way neuroscientists report research does matter to the public. So there was this paper that came out maybe 10 years ago now called The Seductive Allure of Neuroscience Explanations. And what it showed was that if you give groups of people anything, any factual fact, and you say, neuroscientific studies have shown us this, compared to without neuroscience, just studies have shown us this, people are more likely to believe the fact when the word neuroscience is mentioned there. Okay? Later studies showed, well, that's not strictly speaking very true. There's a selective allure of your neuroscientific explanations. If neuroscience studies show me something I believe to be true, then I'm more likely to believe it. So it's not neuroscience in general, it's just that if I find findings in the literature that fit with my intuitions of what I think is taking place. And most recently, like 2 years ago or so on, another paper came out. I mean, there's a lot, I'm picking out iconic papers in this idea of neuroscientists basically question what we do and what the strengths are and what the weaknesses are. And this is the latest one that says, the seductive allure of the seductive allure. Like, neuroscientists think we're great and what we do is phenomenal and better than what anybody else does. And so we are finding confirmations of this in our own research. The problem of confirmation bias abounds in psychology and neuroscience research, and it really matters for creativity, the kind of field that I am associated with, because we tend to believe very magical things about creativity. So if we find things that fit in with our magical, beliefs, then we're more likely to think that that's true. So I just want you to be aware that I'm aware of this, and also when you come across neuroscientific studies that talk about creativity, you need to think about, are they just confirming what they think is true, or have they really tested for this? So with that, I give you the kind of things that neuroscience is responsible for when we think about the creative brain. There are all sorts of ideas that people have, for instance, that the creative brain is the right brain, that drugs and alcohol boost creativity, that there's a link between mental illness and creativity, that somehow a damaged brain, a deficient brain of some sort leads to better creativity, that creativity is a talent that very few people possess, or that creativity is untrainable. Okay? These are some of the things that my field is responsible for. The question is, are these myths or truths? And I hope to show you that they're neither myths nor truths. They're myths if they're overextended, but what happens is that there's a little kernel of truth in each of these claims, but that's all it is. It's not the whole truth. And when we understand what the kernel of truth is, we understand creativity better. And I hope to convince you of that today. Now, the challenge of studying creativity empirically is a huge one, as I'm sure all of you can appreciate. And it's regardless of the kind of creativity we are looking at. Let's take the case of scientific creativity. Now, the outputs of creativity vary a lot even in science. They can take the form of a discovery, such as, let's say that's a picture of Marie Curie, who is the only person in the world to have won 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences. And she got them because she discovered something new, such as radium, new elements. But that's not the only form of creativity in science. It can also take the form of innovations, technological improvements. In the middle, you see a picture of an incubator. What is unusual about this incubator is that it's made up entirely of car parts. Okay? So this is a kind of solution that was proposed by a company that is very sort of socially aware company that tries to deliver solutions to third world and underdeveloped nations, where a lot of the time you get a lot of aid to send those countries, equipment that they need. But very often these things break down and people don't have kind of a system in place for repairs. So what if you made something entirely out of car parts? So if it broke down in any given country, all you would need is essentially a car mechanic to replace those parts, and then you could still have a functioning system. So that's an innovation that is creative. But of course, scientific creative outputs don't need to be tangible. They can just be take the form of ideas that revolutionize the world. So The picture there is of Darwin or observing a tortoise. The idea of evolution, for instance, is considered to be the most powerful idea of the 20th century. It's not something you can see, but just an intuition that he developed. In the field of the arts, of course, we don't have to look too far to understand that the types of outputs that we see through creative ideation can be widely varied regardless of whether you're looking at the fine arts or the applied arts. So for a creativity researcher like me, the question is, how do you study this empirically? What is the common metric here? Now, one way to do it is to say, well, let's just divide it into types of creativity. Let me say that if I think about artistic creativity, for instance, I can divide it to 4 types, such as visual artistic creativity, musical creativity, literary creativity, kinesthetic or movement-based creativity. And this is different from scientific creativity. So at least I have 5 types of creativity. There's reason to think that you can do this, of course, but we can't make too much of a case of this because there are many forms of creativity that intersect between these domains. So let's take songwriting as an example, is where a domain where musical creativity meets literary creativity. If you look at architecture, it's an example of where visual artistic creativity meets scientific creativity. So the minute you try to impose boundaries, the nature of human behavior, performance, creative abilities is such that we break down these boundaries immediately. So we need to think about what are the elements that form creativity across all domains. Now, one useful way to think about it is to examine what we think creativity is. We use the word constantly, but do we all mean the same things when we're talking about creativity? Now, when you ask people, general public, what they think creativity is, most people will say they associate creativity with artistic abilities. So let's question that for a minute. Let's say I give artists, so anyone, an apple and say, I want you to render this apple in a particular way. And if you look at these sketches that I've picked, both the painting and the sketch are both, I think, very skillful representations of an apple. They're beautiful, in my view. But the question is, are they creative? And if that is the metric of creativity, then what we're saying is that creativity is equivalent to artistic skill. Okay? But not everybody agrees with that. If I say, well, depict an apple a certain way, someone might just turn it around on its head and, make art out of an apple, which can be manifest in many different ways. There are whole websites devoted to apple art for anyone who's interested. But what we're saying is, what people here were saying is, well, it's not really about skill. It's about doing something new in a way that's recognizable. Okay? Still others can say, well, it doesn't have to be creating something new. You just have to do something in a new manner. So, for instance, here's a picture of Hendrix. On the right is one of his iconic one of the iconic images of Jimi Hendrix. The image itself is not new. The way it's been created is new. It's been made with celluloid tape, right? In the other one, the artist has drawn himself into the picture. So that's there's nothing about the image that is new, but the manner in which it's done is where the novelty lies. Others will say, no, well, creativity is about generating something entirely new. So this goes against the idea that, so for instance, I've taken a Lego box there. We often give children Lego boxes and think, well, this improves their creativity or imaginative skills. The truth is, though, that, might do, but really they're following instructions, aren't they, to sort of figure out how to put things together. Again, there are whole websites devoted to Lego art for those interested. Some people will say, no, you use Lego as a piece, but you create something entirely new. It's not about following any kind of mold, per se. If you go into the advertising domain of applied creativity, you see a different form of creativity where you think, well, it is about novelty, but it's not really about, there's something else in the newness. So in the advertising domain, they use like double meanings, double entendres a lot. You're looking at one particular slogan, for instance, but what's being activated in your mind are two or more different frames of understanding or meaning. Okay, so here Coke got into quite a lot of trouble for this. Of course, they wanted to say you're on Diet Coke, but obviously it's been written such that you're thinking you're on Coke. So the juxtaposition, of course, there's obvious. You're switched on versus you're on drugs, right? And they use this constantly, which is why some people have thought, well, it's not just about meaning. It has to go beyond meaning, such as what you see in humor. It's It's about tickling you a particular way, making you surprised in a certain way. Again, advertising here. I don't know if you can see clearly. If you eat pedigree dog food, apparently, you're going to be so strong that your dog can tear through tarmac to get at the bone. And this is where it can get into very dark types of humor. This is an ad for a funeral service, which I think is kind of ingenious. But yeah, but that's what they're hoping for. Like, creativity is where you have to gasp. You have to think, well, wow, that's surprising in some way. Yeah, I didn't expect that. Some people would think, well, you don't have to put the metric up so high. It's just about standing out. If I am somehow different from the rest of the pack, it means that I'm creative. But again, you have to question that as well. I think this illustrates rather well the fashion field is somewhere where you think, well, this oddity, is it always creative? So I've picked out 2 dresses. Let's say this one, which I think is rather cool and unusual for when it came out, and this one, which I think is just bonkers. It's not creative. Now, of course, some of you in the audience might think both of them are equally bonkers or equally cool. The point is, though, is oddness enough of a metric for something to be considered creative? So these are all the sentiments we have when we think about what creativity is. So how do empiricists go about understanding how to test it? Because we can't examine it unless we know how to really define it in some way. When you look across different types of creativity, what gets sort of filtered out is that 2 elements are essential to understand creativity. First is that a product that is creative needs to show the property of novelty. That means it did not exist previously in precisely the same form. And how novel it is depends on the extent to which it deviates from the traditional or the status quo. But that's not enough. The second element is absolutely essential as well. A product is creative to the extent that it is also seen as useful or satisfying or tenable. Okay? So, a creative response, a creative idea is one where you see elements of originality, also called uniqueness, unusualness, novelty, statistical rarity, for those of the quant-minded, and appropriateness, that it's relevant, fitting, meaningful, adaptive to a particular purpose. Now I'm going to show you an example where this can sort of be spelled out a little bit. One of the most commonly used tasks in empirical work on creativity is called the alternative uses task. And you ask people in this task to, for instance, generate as many uses as they can for a common object, such as a shoe. Now I've used this task dozens of times, and you get a range of responses. To illustrate how the definitional elements come together, I'll show you 3. So you can say you can use a shoe to kill an insect, to just stamp on an insect, for instance. Now this is an example of a use that is not original. Why is it not original? Because if I ask everyone in the audience, pretty much 9 out of 10 of you will give this response, or 10 out of 10. But it is a use that is appropriate. You certainly can use a shoe very effectively to kill insects. This is an example that a clinical participant once told me. I said, what can you use a shoe for? And he said, you can use it to wash clothes. And I said, okay, so how would you do that? And he said, I don't know, I just said the first thing that came to my mind. So this is an example of a use that's original. It's original because nobody else I've come across has said that to me, but it's not appropriate because he couldn't explain how it could be used. If he could have done that, that's great, but he didn't do that. Compared to the other 2, saying that a shoe can be used as a sort of makeshift plant pot when your pot breaks, that is an example of a use that is, relatively speaking to the others, both original and appropriate, and therefore meets the criteria of creativity. So creativity is that sweet spot where an original response meets a satisfactory response, an appropriate response to a particular end. So, and this definition applies regardless of the kind of creativity you're looking at, whether you're looking at domains of expression, such as commonly seen in artistic domains, or problem solving, such as seen in scientific domains. Now, I do want to say that there's a lot of unanimity, there's a lot of agreement that these 2 elements are necessary, but there are ideas about whether they're sufficient, okay? So some people will say, well, that's not enough. Originality is essential. Both of these are as essential as combined properties because, for instance, uncommon responses that are merely random or which proceed from ignorance or delusion are not adapted to reality. So it's important that we don't see responses that are only original as creative. And appropriateness is also typically undervalued in creativity, but it's absolutely essential. Appropriateness refers to the fact that a response must serve to solve a problem, fit the needs of a given situation, accomplish some recognizable goal. And this is as true for the expressive arts as for scientific and technological enterprises. In painting, the artist's problem is to find a more appropriate expression of his own experience. In dancing, to convey more adequately a particular mood or theme, etc. Okay? But there is a third element that's increasingly getting traction, and I hope it came across when we were exploring what creativity is in terms of our intuitions, and that is one of surprise. Some people say it's not enough for it to be original and appropriate, it also needs to be surprising. In fact, the US Patent Office insists that if you're going to patent something, it has to be something, an invention, a scientific invention, it has to be something that has an element of surprise in it. What is meant by surprise? Now, Margaret Bowden at the University of Sussex is the key proponent of this idea, and she says there are 3 types of surprise. Something that's statistically surprising, that you think, oh, haven't quite, this is sort of like, it's unusual and it's surprising to me because I haven't thought of it this way, but it makes sense. The second type of surprise is a shock of recognition. This is like when people say, typically in humor you see it, where you think, oh my gosh, I can't believe this person put both those elements together. An impossible surprise, which is basically the kind of surprise that is evoked when you think it's impossible that anyone ever thought of this before. Yeah, these are the real the kinds of products that or ideas that lead to revolutions in different disciplines. If you think about the number of types of appropriateness, it's impossible to quantify that because what's appropriate can differ from context to context, from culture to culture, for instance. So if you think about mink coats at a particular point in time 50 years ago were considered a totally fashionable item that everyone aspired to have, and it made sense in regions of the world that experience a lot of cold. It's appropriate for that region. It's not appropriate for tropical regions of the world. But also now, given that we live in an era where there's a lot of animal rights activism, for instance, fur coats made out of animal hide are just not considered to be acceptable anymore. So what was originally appropriate 50 years ago is no longer so, which is why it becomes very difficult to quantify how many types of appropriateness there are. How many types of originality are there? Well, there's been an argument to recognize that there are at least 2 types of originality in creativity. One refers to little c, everyday creativity, or P creativity. This refers to your own psychological or personal creativity. So let's say when I do something creative, let's say I'm writing a poem, I can estimate whether the poem I'm writing today is better than the one that I wrote a month ago, right? But if I showed it to other people, they would think, well, honey, that's cute, but it's just kind of amateurish, right? Presumably, if I write enough poetry in my lifetime to deserve something like a Nobel Prize or something, I would be exhibiting not just P creativity that is wonderful for myself, but also age creativity, historical creativity, the kind of originality that is shown by someone that we know to have been the first person to have that kind of idea. Okay? These are 2 very different levels. Both are important, but they're quite different in terms of magnitude. This falls into what we call little c creativity, everyday creativity that all of us exhibit, and big C creativity, eminence in creativity that not everybody exhibits, or we might take a while to, that very few people, let's say, are recognized of having exhibited. Some people have thought, well, 2 categories is not enough. We need to have a more nuanced gradation of magnitude. So we need to recognize that children, for instance, are exhibiting a kind of very subjective everyday creativity that is very different from the kind of creativity that I might be exhibiting when I'm writing my poem, which is kind of everyday but a little more objective. This is different from professional levels of creativity, people who have talent and drive and are exhibiting their work perhaps, or have shown to have some sort of productivity. And that in turn is very different from eminence in creativity, the kind of people whose products, whose ideas change the world. What we know from a lot of creativity research, unmistakably, is that every single human being possesses the drive to create. All of us. What differs, though, is how we pursue this drive. It's a fundamental drive to create. There's nothing that we have to learn in this. The question is why some people do this more than others. Now, there are lots of ideas about why this is true. So many people think that, well, only talented people actually pursue their creative drives more than others. Some believe that, well, the ones who have opportunity are the ones who get to pursue their this drive. There's an idea that it's more about internal factors, like people who pursue this drive have more perseverance, they persevere more to their goals, they're more driven in general. Or that when people who pursue this drive approach their task kind of differently, they see the task in itself as very rewarding. Okay? Which of these is true, or are they all true in some case? To answer these sorts of questions, creativity researchers, particularly psychologists, study creativity using one of 4 approaches typically. You can study creativity in terms of the place. So what are the conditions in your environment that are conducive or counterproductive to creativity? Does it matter, for instance, if you read to your child, does that impact their creativity? That's a place kind of question to ask. They also look at the personality attributes and intellectual attributes of the kind of people who have achieved eminence in creativity. Yeah? Is there something about Marie Curie's personal attributes that made her more likely to be creative than others? You can also examine creativity at the level of the product. What makes this painting more creative? Why do we consider this particular painting more creative than this other painting by a particular artist, for instance? Or you can study it in terms of the process. What is happening in your mind when you're trying to be creative? Okay? So the process approach is essentially what neuroscientists like myself adopt typically. We want to understand the difference between what happens in your mind when you're reading a poem, when you're reciting a poem from memory, and when you're inventing your own poem. What are the similarities and differences when you're trying to be creative versus when you're not trying to be creative? The product level is essentially used to say, well, what is it about a specific period of time that says this is creative and the other ones are not? Is this the most creative work of a particular artist or not? And so on. Do we quantify creativity in terms of the number of paintings a person has created? And so on and so forth. Place aspects of creativity are very strongly researched in the workplace. So what can you do in the workplace to promote creativity? Yeah? Does it matter what your office is like? Does it matter how much time? Does it matter how much time you get to devote to your own kinds of projects and so on? Is originality valued in the workplace? And person types of approaches look at what is it that eminent people across the spectrum, whether you're an artist or a scientist, have in common in terms of creative attributes. This is actually surprisingly well studied. And what has come out is that these 5 variables seem to be incredibly important and seem to characterize highly original thinkers, regardless of the field they're in. The first thing is that these people show a high degree of what's called intrinsic motivation. They pursue their subjects because they find it inherently rewarding. Just thinking about their work is a reward to them. They have surprisingly wide interests. Incredibly wide interests. They're not narrowly focused on their own little fields of interest. They have a high degree of openness to new experiences. They enjoy trying new things. They're highly autonomous and independent in the way that they work, in the way that they think, in the way that they do things. And they're very unconventional and and they are not averse to taking risks. So let's just look at one of those factors, motivation. What is meant by intrinsic motivation? It's very important in the student context particularly. You can engage in an activity because it either reduces some biological need that you have, or because it has an incentive factor. It gives you a reward in some way. Or you can engage in an activity because you find the activity rewarding in itself. So let's say in an educational perspective, if you go to university only to get the degree at the end, you're not going to find it particularly intrinsically rewarding because all you want is that let's say that certificate at the end, which is a legitimate need to have. It's totally fine. But you're pursuing that need for a different kind of motivation than someone who attends university because they enjoy knowledge. Yeah? So this person will not only gain more from their learning, but because they find it more rewarding. The whole experience of it will be, and it will stay with them for longer. So when we look at all of these factors, I've only focused on drive a little bit, what we find is that none of these elements in isolation paint the whole picture. And I can tell you a little bit about why that is as time goes on. So creativity, as we know, is not a talent that few possess. Because everybody has this drive. The reason why people pursue it more than others is because of several factors, including the drive that you have, the opportunities that you have, and so on. So hopefully that myth has been busted a little bit. To talk about the next myth busting, I'm going to talk about my particularly approach to understanding creativity. I proposed recently that we need to have 5 P's of creativity, the physiological approach, where you look at how your brain and the rest of your body have markers for creative ideation, is a really important approach to understand creativity in general. So you can look at, for instance, the kind of things I've looked at, how is the brain directly involved? Or you can look at other physiological markers, such as when I look at a work of art, can I sort of mark my enjoyment based on the level of aesthetic thrills and goosebumps I get, and so on. If I look at something that's evocative and meaningful to me, does my heartbeat change, and so on? Do my pupils dilate in size, and so on? When you take a neuroscientific approach like I do, you adopt one of many approaches. The most common one is what's called functional neuroimaging. Here you shove someone lying down into an MRI scanner like that. They usually have goggles on their heads so they can't see what's around them. And what you project into their goggles is some sort of, let's say this task over here, the person has a particular task to do, that's all they see. And they have to respond in a particular manner. There's a little response box at their hand, the right or left hand. And they're given cues as to when to respond. And based on how they respond in direct relation to a task, and let's say we can see activity in particular areas of the brain, and we know, okay, this particular area is involved in that particular type of task. Okay? We're looking at where the blood flow is going when someone is engaged in a particular task. A very different type of approach is to take electrophysiology. This is when you put electrodes on people's heads, and then you again measure brain activity patterns. This time you're looking at actual neural activity, and again we can look at it in relation to a person's response on a task. The neuropsychological approach is a little bit different. You can test people. This is a neuropsychological approach is when you test people typically with specific types of damage to their brain. And you give them a range of tasks to respond on, and depending on what they get, they're able to perform well and not able to perform well. We know that that particular region is involved in that particular kind of task. So an example, for instance, of a single dissociation would be if me, the patient, performs badly on task X, but I'm fine on task Y. I'll give you an example to give you a sense of what this is like. This particular region of the brain, the TPOJ, the temporopalatal occipital junction, some people, due to different types of reasons, like stroke and so on, have damage in that area. And one of the things that they report is the experience of out-of-body experiences. Okay? They have no other spatial or object recognition problems. All they see is that they have this particular kind of spatial problem that is egocentrically located. They see themselves as being, well, typically like that, but it can differ depending on the kind of lesion you have. And because it's on this part of the outer rim of the brain, if you can actually stimulate that area from externally using magnetic pulses. And when you do that, you can induce the person to have the experience temporarily of an out-of-body experience, or like a phantom person behind them, and so on. So neuropsychological studies are very useful to tell us whether particular parts of the brain are involved in particular aspects of function, and we can use that for creativity as well. So how do we test for these creativity tasks, and what are our intuitions about why a creativity task is different from other tasks? Now, creativity tasks follow from sort of problem-solving approaches. You know you have a problem when you're faced with a situation where the solution is not apparent. So you engage in problem-solving processes in order to start from an initial state and get to a goal state. So let's take a very simple problem, a problem of hunger, that we are all very familiar with. We know what the initial state feels like, because we know what it's like to feel hungry, and we know what the goal state feels like, or feeling sated. What we have to work out in this problem is how to get from the initial state to the goal state. And the operation state, the way you get from one place to the other, depends on a range of factors, including how much money you have, where you are at present, what you had yesterday, and so on and so forth. In creative problem solving, what happens is that you might be given an initial state, such as the one here, but your operation state is unknown, and your goal state is very often also unknown. So I'll give you the example over here. This is the famous Duncker candle task. that was devised in the 1940s. You ask people to using these materials to fix a candle to the wall in such a manner that it burns safely without dropping wax anywhere. Okay? You can give them like a makeshift wall to do it with. And what happens is that it's actually quite a difficult task for subjects to do. And they go about it in many different strategies. One way to do it is to like form sub-goals, break the problem down. Okay, how do I fix this to the wall? And then I'm going to think about how to burn it safely. You can use analogical reasoning of some sort. You might try to think about, okay, when did I last have to do this kind of task before? But ultimately what this task requires is to change mental set, to overcome what's called functional fixedness. The reason this task is difficult is because by giving the matches in the box, you make people force them to think in a functionally fixed manner. It's only seen as a matchbox. They have to overcome the functional fixedness by emptying out the matches, typically. Yeah? If you give the same task with the matches outside the box, it's solved much faster. Okay? So creative problem solving can be of two types. It can be about convergent problem solving, which is where you have just one solution. But what's creative about that is that you have to completely change perspectives and overcome functional fixedness in order to solve that problem. You go on a non-linear path, or it can be what's called divergent in nature, where there are many solutions to a particular problem. What we do then is to say, okay, we have an open-ended problem or a closed-ended problem, it doesn't matter. Let's take the problem I've introduced you to already, the alternative uses task, and I just tell the person, generate as many uses as you can for a shoe. And I don't tell them what kind of shoe, I just say shoe. People engage in a range of processes when they're trying to do this. First thing they do is to try and expand the concepts of a shoe. So, oh my gosh, what can I use a shoe for that's beyond foot protection? Let me look at a shoe. A shoe is a kind of container, right? That's me expanding my concepts. You also have to overcome your knowledge constraints. You might have said, well, I can use a shoe to kill a spider, and maybe then a cockroach, and then another bug, and then you have to think, oh, no, I have to get over my own knowledge to try and do something new. You might engage in a form of imagery. You'd think, okay, she didn't really specify the kind of shoe. What kind of shoe should I pick? Well, if I choose a sneaker, it has a different affordance than a stiletto, for instance. You automatically start to think about things like engage in analogical reasoning. Shoe is to down below, as hat is to up above. Metaphors start to be activated automatically. Kick your shoes off means to relax in English. And then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, you get a solution. Okay? So this subject, for instance, said to me that you could use a stiletto as a baby hamster slide. Now, if you look at any of those elements, all of them have somehow indirectly informed that intuition, but no one thing was enough, right? They all came together. And all of these aspects of creative cognition are important to examine when you're thinking about the creative brain. What our studies have shown in the neurosciences is that creative cognition is extremely complex and extremely multifaceted, and we can use neuroscientific approaches to try and understand how it all works together. So let's take the scheme that I've done before and the conceptual expansion task. The original task to assess conceptual expansion, or our ability to widen the boundaries of acquired structures, took the form of what's called now as the animal task. So here are our subjects to imagine an animal that lives on a planet that's very different from Earth. Okay? And they have to try and imagine animals that are very, 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 very different from Earth. And they asked to imagine and draw these animals from two perspectives, from the side and from the front. So in the original paper, these were some of the animals that were drawn. They're given like 3-4 minutes to draw it. It's a very simple assessment task. What you're looking at is how the extent to which the produced animal differs from a generic idea of an animal, okay? So you can see there are just 5 elements there. Bilateral symmetry, you look to see whether the subject managed to generate an animal that is not bilaterally symmetrical. For some reason, human beings find it very difficult to imagine a being that is asymmetrical, presumably because our left sides and our right sides are very similar, as is the case for most of the animal kingdom. So, for instance, this would not be very creative. This does not lack bilateral symmetry, not only these two do. Then you look for appendages. How many of the typical appendages are there? Arms, legs, wings, and so on. And how many of the sense organs are there? Eyes, nose, mouth. And you look for unusual things that they've explained. Based on how they perform, you can see, well, is it a high degree of conceptual expansion there? or is it a low degree of conceptual expansion? Okay? Compare this with another kind of task, overcoming knowledge constraints. Here I ask my participants to think that they're employed by a toy company that's in need of ideas for new toys. And you're not allowed to create toys that already existed or previously existed. And what I tell them, this is really hard to do. Subjects will immediately gasp. And you think, oh, don't worry, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to show you examples of toys that were created by other people. Unbeknownst to the participants, these examples are rigged, okay? All of them have three elements in common. There's always the presence of a ball. There's always the presence of electronic activity. And there's always the idea that there's some implicit physical movement involved. You can't show the movement, but it's implicit in the tasks. Now, in the original study that devised this task, what they showed was subjects who were exposed to the examples were very, very constrained. When you're asked to be creative and you see original things that other people did, this is a huge constraint on your ability to create. Whereas, of course, the people who didn't have any exposure to examples had no problem with this. So, in terms of a brain-based view, how do people fare when they have specific lesions to the brain on this task? So I'll show you studies. I'll show you a finding when I looked at patients with basal ganglia lesions versus parietotemporal lobe lesions. It doesn't matter where these are. It's just important to know that basal ganglia lesion patients are known to be very distractible. Okay? That's the core symptom. Whereas parietotemporal lesions, patients with those lesions tend to be show perseveration responses. If you ask them to think of, let's say, an animal that begins with the letter A, they'll say ant, ant, ant. They'll keep just harping on the same kind of semantic association. So how do these guys fare on these two tasks that I mentioned to you? If you look at the animal task, you compare the patients to neurotypical controls that they're matched with. There's no difference between their performance on the animal task. But if you see how they respond on the toy task, what you see is that the parietotemporal patients who persevere are worse on this task, whereas the basal ganglia patients are better on this task. Okay? So what happens is that if you tend to persevere, the first idea you have will always be something that you fixate on. Whereas if you're distractible, something that is actually posed as distracted to you, you can just overlook it very easily. You're not going to be as uncreative as a result of that. Okay? This is very selective. They showed no other advantages on any other aspect of creative cognition and fits with the kind of patterns that you see in other populations, including children with ADHD and so on. So what these things push us to consider is when I'm looking at creativity and what happens in my mind when I'm trying to be creative, I need to think about what is it about my mind that is different? Is the creative part of my mind different from the non-creative part of my mind? Do they partially overlap? And a lot of brain research has showed us that there's no single brain region, no single brain network, no single brain activity pattern that is exclusively in place for creativity. Yeah, this is absolutely clear from decades of brain research on creativity. What seems to be the case is that you just have cognition, mental operations, but what happens in the case of creativity is that it's applied in an open-ended manner. The goal state is unknown. The operation state is unknown. You have to work things out for yourself. So you're using your usual capacities of attention, memory, executive function, and so on, but you're applying it in a context where you have to generate something new. So the context is what is important, not so much what's going on there. But how you use your brain is important, of course. Yeah? This leads me to the next thing, which is the left brain, right brain idea. This is a huge meme in the world, which is why Mercedes-Benz can use this ad, because they know that everyone believes this. They're saying that their car is both left-brained and right-brained. Left-brained because the left brain is a scientist, a mathematician. It is always in control, it's practical, and so on. And the right brain is I'm creativity, I'm a free spirit, I am passion, yearning, sensuality, and so on. And they're trying to say that they're both, right? The only reason this ad works is if we know what is meant by the creative right brain. The idea is basically that there's one part of our minds that is controlled, rational, a face to the world, and hidden is this other part of our mind that is completely bonkers. is very free and just absolutely filled with ideas and passion, and they are somehow in opposition to one another. The so-called dual systems ideas. And there are many ways in which you come across these ideas: left brain, right brain, associative, executive, closed mode, open mode, and so on and so forth. One part is exciting, the other part is boring, okay, essentially. The question is there any truth to that? Oops. I don't know whether that's colored yet, but okay. Interestingly enough, there are two brain systems that kind of match these intuitions that we have. We have the so-called default mode network that is entirely involved in internal mentation. Like when you have nothing particularly to do or when you're daydreaming, this network kicks into place. Anytime you're resting, anytime you're not focused, this network lights up. And on the other hand, when you're focused, really, really trying to concentrate, this other network is online, okay? The central executive network. So a lot of people presumed that this right brain, this exciting part of the brain, if this part shuts down, that we can be more creative. And that comes from a lot of evidence out there, but the intuition, and I'm going to give you examples of a couple of them. Here's a drawing made by a child called Nadia at the age of 5, who was diagnosed as an autistic savant. She had no language, she had no ability to really communicate with other human beings, but she drew. She started to draw at the age of 3, and this was the kind of drawing of a horse she made at 5. This is what a typical 8-year-old would make, and experts in the field of art have said that her drawing at the age of 5 is closer to what Da Vinci made in his prime years than a typical 8-year-old. What happened in the case of Nadia was, it's atypical for that kind of thing, is that she was taught language as a teenager after that. She was trained in speaking. And once she got better at language, her drawing skills just sort of stopped. She stopped drawing. So the idea that you need to have some sort of disrupted brain to be creative was this kind of results spoke to that idea. There's also work on people with what's called frontotemporal dementia. That's when the frontalmost parts of your brain start to atrophy. This is much older people. A subset of these patients go on to develop incredible artistic skills post-stroke. Okay? Not all of them, but a big enough subset of them. And these are typically people who had no interest in the arts before that. But suddenly, after the parts of their brain get damaged, they become sort of compulsive painters, so much so that they leave their old jobs. And in this first study, the 5 that were studied all went on to become artists. Okay? There's also the idea, of course, about creativity and mental illness, something that I've worked on myself. So let's just look at these. And the idea there is that, there's this Goldilocks effect. Too much control or too little control is bad for creativity. Yeah? But there's a sweet spot, neither too much nor too little, just right, that's good for creativity. Okay? These are the ideas in there. What evidence is there for this? There are these great sampling studies now where you can look at, in Scandinavia, they have these registries of people's whole lives, I think, all their health information, that of their parents and the ones after them, combined with their professional information, their educational information, everything. And what you can do is to look for particular patterns if you are in a creative profession, are you a little more likely to suffer from some form of mental illness? Are your parents more likely to suffer from some form of mental illness? Are your children more likely to suffer from some form of mental illness? And are those people more likely to be artists later? It's interesting questions. So in this case, they looked at 300,000 people, okay? And they looked at different types of mental illness. I'm going to very slowly explain these graphs to you. They looked at, I don't know why that's jumped, but okay, schizophrenia is one thing. So this is the line that matters. Anything right to the line means yes, this is significant. Anything left of the line means there is no association. Okay? So what they found was that if a person was an artist, were they more likely to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia compared to someone generally in the population who's not an artist? What they saw was if you had schizophrenia, you were more likely to be an artist, but your sibling was more likely to be an artist, your offspring was more likely to be an artist, your parent's sibling was, and so on and so forth. So people suffering from this, so you were not more likely to, but there is a genetic component there. It was different in the case of bipolar disorder, where not only people who had it, but also their relatives, preceding and after, were more likely to have it. But none of this was true of people with unipolar depression. Okay? So there seems to be an association, small one, between the propensity of having these disorders and creative ideation, but it does matter what kind of disorder it is and what relation it is to the person in question. And we can have questions about why that is. It's rather well explained why this comes about. So the creativity mental illness link is there, but it's not. It's much more nuanced than people think it is. It matters what the disorder is and the degree of relation, the degree of whether you have traits of it or whether you're suffering from it yourself. So hopefully that myth is busted as well. All of this, though, falls on what's called paradoxical functional facilitation. The idea that if some part of your brain is switched off, that there are advantages to be had from there. And there's a whole book on it that's actually really quite interesting. What's important is that this is definitely true. There are enough case studies there to say, well, something happens, someone gets in an accident, and suddenly they become proficient musician. Something happens, something awful accident they're in, and suddenly they're able to have the most amazing photographic memories in the world. Paradoxical functional facilitation exists, but it's not necessarily creative. Okay? An example I'll show you is this man, very famous, died a few years ago, Kim Peek. The movie Rain Man was based on his case. He suffered from savant syndrome, and he had the most incredible photographic memory that has ever been documented, really. At the time point of his death, he had a mental library of over 10,000 books. And what he did was he didn't really read. He would just scan the page in a few seconds and turn and scan and scan. And you could ask him what's on page 14 of this particular book, and he would be able to tell you. Okay? Completely photographic memory. Did a lot of help for his local community where he lived, where it was really important for someone who had this kind of community. If you looked at Kim Peek's brain, this is what a normal brain looks like if you cut through the middle and you look at it from the side. If you look at Kim Peek's brain in comparison to a neurotypical brain, what you see is that it looks very, very different. Mainly that the corpus callosum, the tract that connects the left and the right parts of the brain, are completely missing. Again, fits with the idea of if something is wrong, you're going to have amazing powers. By and large, we know this is not true, by the way, but there are enough cases to say, well, there must be something there. Now, while Kim's, what's important to note is that his abilities are amazing, but you wouldn't consider them creative. He has amazing memory skills, incredible memory skills, but that doesn't make you more creative necessarily, and that's the thing to keep in mind. Yeah? In fact, there's a great quote by Dalia Zadel who said, in the neurological cases, even the ones who, after frontotemporal dementia or something, the turning to art, yeah? The turning to art is in itself innovative. The produced art, however, is not necessarily creative. So it's creative. It's creative for me. It's innovative for me, but it may not be something that is creative for everybody. So there's a need to consider the magnitude of creativity when we look at these responses. Okay? So it turns out that if you knock out one side of your system, you might be more creative for yourself, but it might make you be creative. Yeah? But to be truly creative, to achieve something that is recognized and be considered extremely original by more than yourself, you need both sides to be functioning extremely well together. Okay? So it's important to not just stress on originality, but to also consider appropriateness, the other defining element of creativity. That's been busted. Okay. I also wanted to say that newer findings now, it's really rare to find this, is that what happens when you find artists who develop brain damage? What happens to their creativity, right? Now, there's only one case of brain scans associated with that. So this was a person who was an artist by profession, and she needed to get brain scans periodically because of something she had as a child. She had a little tumor on her auditory nerve that got operated, and she had to keep going in for scans every couple of years just to make sure it hadn't come back. So you have scans of her brain that are pre-symptomatic, to when she first was diagnosed and then the latest examination. And what happened was rather cool is that because she was an artist all her life, you have her artworks at each of those time points. Okay? So this is just from 1998 to 2004. What you see is that there is a change in the kind of style. Now, nobody can, of course, tell you whether she would have naturally had this change in style or whether it's due to her brain-based differences. This is impossible to tell. But she does go from very, very abstract kinds of representations to extremely concrete types of representations in her art later on. Okay? What's really interesting, though, about the artist is that she continues to be creative. And this is extremely well-studied phenomenon. There are 2 massive volumes on the fine arts, neurology, and neuroscience, where they look at people who have had all sorts of different things happen to their brains and whether it affects their capacity to create. And what's amazing to be seen is that people continue to be creative. If there's something to be said that's unique about the study, psychological and neuroscientific study of creativity, it is this. It is that most other aspects of whether it's language or memory, a little lesion here will knock out whole functions. But even if, as an artist, you're unable to use your left hand anymore, and that's the hand you use to paint, people will find a way to use it right. Even if they can't communicate the same way anymore or have to change the way that they produce, they still find a way to do it. Actually, what it speaks to is that there's a damage-resistant capacity of the brain to engage in artistic expression. This is very clear from all of the literature. And there are ideas about why this could be. Some people think, well, it's basically the drive to communicate. If typically what happens after stroke and so on, very often you're unable to speak and communicate like you used to do, people might take alternative routes, artistic expression, in order to be able to express themselves in some form. The need to communicate is always there. So hopefully I've been able to tell you a little bit about how brain damage is linked to creativity. There are, of course, a ton of critical issues to talk about in creativity that I'm not going to talk about, all of them, intelligence and the dark side of creativity and the problem of recognizing creativity and so on. So I'm just going to pick on the thing that most people tend to focus on a lot, that alcohol and drugs are somehow linked to creativity. What is the verdict on that? There's actually, you can imagine, very little empirical work on the topic. It's almost impossible to get ethical permission to do these sorts of studies in a way that is very meaningful. The idea, though, is that if I consume something that's going to make me more disinhibited, I'm likely to be more creative. And there's perfect sense to assume that. Okay? In general, what we can say is that there are mixed findings with relation to mild or moderate consumption. And there's definitely a negative effect in relation to excess consumption. Okay? Now, and this fits in with a lot of what writers and all have claimed. So the first, there's a lot of alcoholism associated with creative writing. And part of it is really trying to get yourself disinhibited, but you become habituated to the level that you used to that it just falls into the negative area very quickly. Let's look at this example, for instance. I'm just going to take you. This is looking at convergent creative thinking, one problem. When a person is sober compared to intoxicated, and the degree to which they have creative solutions, that is in black, and non-creative problem solving, what you see is that there's a slight improvement in solving creative problems, but not non-creative problems, under the influence of a little bit of alcohol. Okay? Similar kind of thing here. It doesn't help divergent thinking at all. It does seem to do something to convergent thinking. Okay? Compared to having a placebo, having a little bit of alcohol improves your ability to change perspectives and reaching that one correct solution. Mild levels of alcohol. What about drugs? Again, depends on, the findings are mixed, depends, of course, on the type of task, the type of drug, and your level of creativity as a study participant. So if you look at this example, this is looking at divergent thinking, like the alternative uses task. What seems to matter is your level of creativity. So if you're a low creative subject, yeah, or a high creative subject in gray, the low creative subject in dark gray, a highly creative subject is not going to be more creative under intoxication. So if you are very creative, no amount of drugs are going to help you, apparently, in this case. But if you're not that creative, drugs are going to help you a little bit. That's marijuana. What about ayahuasca tea? Again, it's very different. There's a slight effect For convergent thinking, it reduces after, and divergent thinking increases after. Differing effects depending on the kind of task that you look at. I'm not advocating that you guys go out and do this. I'm just showing you the science. Okay. What's interesting is a recent review. Okay? Creativity and psychoactive substance abuse. So what he says is, the general results suggest that there is an association between creativity and substance abuse. However, the studies were unable to show that the substance abuse directly contributed to the growth of creativity or facilitated creative artistic process. That means parts of being in creative communities is that there's a little more permissiveness associated with the taking of drugs and so on, and that could just be the association there, that you happen to be taking it more. It doesn't mean that it makes you more creative. One person who studied, a very creative artist, who himself studied the effects of taking psychoactive drugs, for instance, psychedelic drugs such as LSD on himself, was Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Brave New World. And he was asked about this. Do you see any relation between the creative process and the use of drugs such as LSD? And he says, well, it's quite clear that there's an enormous variation in the way the people respond to the drugs, so you can't really reach any clear conclusions. Also important to note, during the experience, you're not really interested in doing anything practical, such as writing that novel. Yeah? But he does make a case for there might be some people who might gain from it, and he talks about this person, Odilon Redon, who was an amazing artist and a synesthete. So if you see the world slightly differently, it might help you. Yeah? And he does give him, these experiences might be interesting to show you about what your mind is capable of experiencing, but it's not in any way going to be tied to your creative output, because it's a fleeting experience. You can't remember exactly what you've gone to in order for it to have a massive effect. Okay? So that's what neuroscience has told us about drugs and alcohol. The last thing is training and creativity. Is creativity trainable or not? In the arts or the sciences. So does long-term training lead to improvements in performance? And you know this intuitively that it's definitely true. The more you work at something, the better you get at it. But you get also better at creativity. You might get better at writing something. Your skills might improve in terms of dancing, in terms of painting. But are you going to have more creative ideas is the question as well. Now, this is actually well studied in terms of skills. So if you look at the music domain, for instance, and you look at the age of idleness and compared it to like the amounts of hourly practice in the week, what you see is these interesting effects. Yeah, the best students and the good students both have are practicing somewhere between 20 to 30 hours per week on average. Okay, compared to the less accomplished students. The more you practice, the better you get. And if you looked at over the age of the accumulated practice from the age of 4, for instance, you see again that what's interesting is that the good students and the best students don't differentiate that much, which speaks to the training is not everything, yeah? But they do differentiate themselves from less accomplished people. So the more hours of training around the 10,000 mark, the better your abilities. What about visual art? There was one, I've only come across one study that has done this quite so well. This study looked at a group of students at university who took a drawing course, basically, okay? And they had it was basically a 3-month-long observational drawing course, and they compared them to students who didn't do that course. And what they were trained to do was as follows. You were shown a picture, and you had to essentially do a gesture. You depict that gesture in like 30 seconds. And they have to keep doing this, of course, over the period of 3 months, yeah, and get progressively better. So you have the experimental group, the group that actually got the drawing course, and a control group who didn't do any art course at the time. So what they showed was as follows. Art students, shown in green here, okay, they're obviously higher in general, because only if you're interested in art are you going to do that course, and you probably have higher skills to start with. Showed improvement, got better at gesture drawing than the ones who weren't. That's fairly obvious. The other ones weren't getting any kind of training. Yeah. What's interesting here is that if you feed this to a sort of computational machine algorithm to say, well, can you differentiate between the brains of the ones who've taken the course compared to not after you see the drawings? basically after 2 months onwards, the classifier was able to distinguish, based on the drawings alone, which brains that they were looking at belonged to the art students and which one didn't. If you looked at the brain itself and looked at white matter tracks, okay, and see, when you compare the art students to the non-art students over this period of 3 months where they're constantly being tested, what happens? This is the white matter structure. So relative to control participants, shown in light here, art students showed reduced fractional anisotropy over time. Okay, that means their white matter volume reduced. So they start at the same level in terms of what their brains are like, and then with training, the white matter volume reduces. Now there are a lot of questions about what this reflects. That's not been directly proved, but the understanding is that the more automated a task becomes, the less you need to devote resources to it. Yeah, but that hasn't been directly shown yet. But that's the intuition. Okay, so even in 3 months, you see brain-related differences. And the big question: does it impact general creative thinking on creativity measures like the alternative uses task, for instance? This is a visual version of that. Art students compared to non-art students also increased in creative thinking compared to controls, figural creative thinking. And in specific aspects, particularly in the ability to think divergently, model systems and processes, and portray imagery. Okay? So it seems like having specific artistic training doesn't just make you better at drawing that you're being trained at, it also improves your ability on other types of nonverbal or imagery, figural creativity tasks. So in general, yes, long-term training, as we all know, leads to a resounding yes in terms of improving skill. This is what we refer to as expertise-based differences. And there seems to be some evidence to show that this is not as well studied, but that it also generically improves your ability to be creative. Okay? But the last note I will leave you with is this. If you look at the kind of studies that look at how much deliberate, if you look at the proportion of differences that are explained in different domains, like music, for instance, by deliberate practice, you will see that deliberate practice makes a difference, but it only accounts for 21 to 26 or whatever percentage of the differences that you're seeing. That's like a quarter of the variance that explains. It explains something significant, but it can't be the whole story of why people are more creative. That's important to keep in mind. Yeah? I took this quote from Pat Metheny, who's one of the biggest improvisers in the world, jazz guitarist. He improvises every single night. That's the kind of practice he has. And he was asked, for instance, about who's influenced him. Okay? I'm going to ask you about some of the artists that you've played with, blah, blah, blah. Are there other artists? So he says, maybe we should spend just a little bit of time on Gary Sibbles, jazz trumpeter. Because to me, his impact in terms of improvisation was so enormous. First of all, as a fan, because I joined his band, because before I joined his band, he was already one of my favorite improvising musicians. But most importantly, the actual experience of standing next to him night after night for 3 years is something that I can't really say I've experienced with anyone else to the degree that I've experienced with him. This points to intrinsic motivation, opportunity. He had talent, sure, but he had all of these things together, and all of them together led him to be the kind of musician that he is today. So focusing on any one attribute will always lead you astray. To sort of think of it as a systemic way, to imagine how all of these little ingredients come together, is what tells you how creativity works. So I hope I've been able to convince you the utility of the neuroscientific approach, but also to bust. My main purpose here was to give you a sense of what's real and what's not real. There's a little kernel of truth in all of these myths, but it's definitely not the whole truth. Okay? If you're more interested in the kind of work that I do, there is the book that Kip was talking to you about. And in general, there's another book, an edited volume that's coming out next year. It's the handbook, Cambridge Handbook of the Imagination, more widely. It's a multidisciplinary sort of volume that looks at what archaeologists, anthropologists, psychologists, artists, theologians, and so on think of and how they conceive of the imagination that you might find interesting. It's coming out in April 2020. Thank you for being such an attentive audience.